Teachers of Reddit, what is the weirdest excuse you've ever heard that turned out to be true? I had a 6th grader come into class very sleepy during test day. I asked her why and she said she is sleeping next to her dead grandma in the living room and has been too scared to sleep. I asked her parents about this. Turns out it's a cultural practice of theirs to keep a dead relative in the home for a few days while their spirit makes a journey to the afterlife. To answer some of your questions, she was from a large Hmong family that lived in a small apartment. She also mentioned before the grandmother passed her family attached bells to the grandmother's clothing to scare away the spirits that were making her sick. I was the student. My grandparents were driving me to school and my neighbor's cow got out of their field, completely blocking the road. Because cows are stubborn and it took us forever to help my neighbor get the cow back in, I was late. Knowing my teacher was a dick, my grandma came down to the class with me to let him know what happened. He didn't believe her. I still can't wrap my head around a teacher at a school in a small farming town didn't believe I was late because a cow was blocking the road. Cows are fake moose. My cousin took my homework on vacation to Venezuela. At least the homework had a good time. I had a student miss class because one of his co-workers at his job had been arrested for child pornography and management needed him to cover the shift the guy was supposed to work before he was arrested. The student brought in proof too, thankfully not in the form of CP. One of the girls I know from uni works in a college. Here college is a name for vocational school, and one of her groups of students jokingly said they died when someone was absent from classes. So one day it went morbidly wrong when she asked why, say, Dave was absent. The group replied that he died. She laughed and said okay, but seriously, and the class was just silent. Edit. For additional clarity, yes, it turned out that Dave was dead, for real this time. Very dead. My bio teacher told me this story. During a biology lesson they were outside. My school is near a small lake. A student ended up falling in and getting their legs stuck in the mud. The bio teacher had to rescue them and hose them off behind the school. The next period teacher didn't believe them despite the student being soaking wet. What's with all these stories of students going to their next class soaking wet? If something like that happened in my school, the kid would either go home or get new clothes brought to the school. Nobody wants a soggy kid in their classroom. I had a student who told me he was going to miss one of the exams because he was visiting a famous rapper in Florida with his family. He told me that the rapper, who at the time was a relatively big deal, all over the radio, was his cousin and his family was flying out for a show and he couldn't skip it. I mean, I would have let him make up the exam anyway. I don't really care as long as he takes it. But all his peers and I were kind of like yeah, right. Okay, whatever you say man. He was telling the truth. When he got back from Florida, said famous rapper Skyped into our poetry class and chatted with my students about poetry and lyrics and such. It was actually really cool. I was a student. It was the first day of school. There were 6 of us who were late. The reason, the school bus stop was moved to a new location. We all piled into my mother's car. We went to the principal's office. The office manager said notice letters were sent to us, so she checked her log. The notices were never sent out. Me, the teacher, didn't make cookies for the last day of school before finals as promised because a car drove into my house and they cut off my gas line to check for leaks. I pulled up the local news article as evidence. A teacher at our school promised to make cookies the last day of school, but his baby was born the night before. That was freshman year. It is senior year now, and the teacher still gets asked about the cookies. I gave this one. I was in college. I went back to my house between classes only to find my roommates barricaded inside by police. Why, you might ask? There was a bull moose in our side yard and the fish and game people were very concerned. So my lab isn't until 3 or something, and meanwhile there's like 8 officers having a standoff with a moose in my yard. This continues until someone decides that the moose is an imminent threat and they're going to try to tranquilize it. So they try that and it fails. So now they're going to kill the moose. It gets to be about 2:45 and I need to leave for my class, and I'm summarily informed by the armed officer that my lawn is not safe and I'm to stay inside. So I emailed my professor and was like, look, I know you're not going to believe this, but I'm barricaded in my house and they won't let me leave. I assume this will be on the news tonight. Turns out it was on the news. They interviewed me, and I got an exemption on that lab. He told me later that he was going to 100% fail me because it was the worst excuse ever until he saw the news story. In case it wasn't immediately obvious. Yes, this occurred in Vermont, because where else would this be a problem? My pet rats dragged my history homework into their cage and modified it to fit in with the aesthetic of their shredded paper nest. I told the teacher the next day, who didn't believe me until I could get my dad to vouch for me. Teach was all, well, if she wasn't lying, why didn't she bring the remainder in as proof? My dad, because the papers were shredded and covered in rat urine. Not a teacher, but a fellow student in my grad program last week. Sorry, I have to go. I just got a notification that my TV fell on my cat. Is the cat okay? Hopefully it was a very thin modern TV. They can do some damage, but the TV will probably have more damage than the cat. Not a teacher, but my dog literally ate my homework in high school. I had to read The Great Gatsby in English, and I remember my teacher asking me where my copy of the book was. I told him my dog ate it and he gave me that really, bro? Look. Took out the completely destroyed copy, and the expression on his face when he realized I wasn't lying was priceless. Missing class because my grandmother died. I heard it 3 times from the same student. I heard it from her twice freshman year, which was pretty suspicious, and once her junior year. I asked our principal. Turns out all 3 were legit, and one of her grandmothers was from a second marriage. As a graduate taught for undergrad students, I was teaching an online course and all assignments had to be submitted by midnight. A student emailed me, "This is important," and said her internet was down and she couldn't submit the paper. As in logged into her email on the internet to email me that her internet was down. The way the class was run, if she didn't submit the paper by midnight she got a 0 for the assignment. I replied to her email, "Remember, her internet is down, that if she brought me a hard copy of the paper she could still get her grade." She shows up at my apartment 10 minutes later. I hosted study groups in the community room, with her hard copy paper and a half-melted internet router. She had emailed me from her smartphone that she had for her internship. This was early in the smartphone surge and few people had them. Girl got her grade and we're still in touch. She proved herself to be an incredibly dedicated student and is now in graduate school herself. Not a teacher, but I'm from a small town, and one day like half of my high school was late because a senior decided on his last day he was going to ride his ride-on lawnmower to school, in cut-off Daisy Dukes and a cowboy hat. There's one main access road to the school. He backed shit up for like half an hour between buses and cars. You won't be surprised to know that he goes by the nickname Bubba. I didn't come to school because I was in Mexico at my hypnotist. Yeah, didn't think one would take a day trip to Mexico for a hypnotist and be back the next day, but that was in fact what had happened. You were hypnotized? I failed to show up to class one time, and this is the true story I told my teacher. I was in my electronics lab and the power supply kept making this horrible buzzing, grinding sound. I'd smack it and it'd shut up for a while before doing it again. Now, you're thinking this was my alarm clock and I was dreaming about being in the lab. And you're quite right. The thing is, in this dream I was a gigantic grape with arms and legs and a face. So once I realized that it was my alarm clock and I needed to get to class, I was still enough in the dream to think I was still a grape. And fruit doesn't have to go to class. So I didn't. The teacher stared at me for about 15 seconds and said I wish I was a grape. And not another word was said about it. Not me, but a friend. Substitute teaching for a day. Walks into class, "Hi, I am your teacher for the day." I am told you have homework, can you hand it in now please? Student raises hand, I don't have my homework teacher. And why's that? Student, we weren't given homework teacher. Oh yes you were. Student, nope. Teacher gets angry about how she knows they were given homework and just because she was a new teacher didn't mean that they can walk over her. Different teacher walks in, turned out the sub teacher was in the wrong classroom. I was the student. My goat ate my homework. I had to bring the goat in to prove I had a goat. Maybe the teacher believed you but made you bring in your goat so she could pet it. I did bring in what was left of the homework. Teacher probably thought there's either a real goat, or this kid ate half the homework just to get out of it. Obligatory, not a teacher but someone I went to school with who was late a lot came in one day talking about how he was watching the news. Yeah right, David. And why exactly were you watching the news? Some plane had just flown into a building in New York. My where were you moment is sitting in social studies class listening to a kid tell the most obvious lie he had ever told. Only for it to be the truth.